"And you are sure you're not going to join?" James asked, with a slightly hesitant and concerned expression on his face, as he looked up at the giant woman in front of him. This place isn't entirely cleared yet, and after everything that's happened... A gentle hum came from Moar's calm voice as a long furred arm reached down to sink a clawed hand onto James's shoulder.
"I understand, James, but I am fine, believe me,"
the old Raphaelite explained in a gentle tone, and her four notched horns threw long shadows over James as he tilted her head down to look at him.
"I know you are worried sick about me, and I am very thankful to have you looking out for me. But for the time being, I do feel quite safe here, especially now that all the humans have arrived. And I would still like to catch up with Chris some more. I know it must seem like we already caught up a lot, but at our advanced age, there are a lot of things we have to say after a long time of not seeing each other. And despite what she may have told you, it did not seem like the Admiral was all too worried about my health either."
At the mention of having him look out for her, James grimaced deeply, but he bit his tongue against making any self-depreciating comment on the matter. "Okay, alright. It's just..." James began to say, although admittedly he had no idea how he ever wanted to finish that sentence. And instead of thinking about it further, he gave in to his immediate impulse, which was to burst forwards and wrap his arms around the old lady. Or, well, whatever part of her he could reach, at least, which in this case was just her leg. His eyes closed. He felt her bushy fur yield under the force of his embrace, and he did not care one bit as some of the hairs tickled along his nose, or even poked into his closed eyes as his face got buried in it. "I'm so fucking sorry," was all he could say under his breath as he pressed against her, the only thing still on his mind being a reminder to hold back his strength, and especially that of his artificial arm so he wouldn't actually injure her. There was a mild rustle of her fur as Moar reached down her arm even further, gently placing her hand on his back, lightly scratching it with the dull tips of her three large claws.
There, she said gently. "There is nothing to apologize for. You did not make anyone attack us, and you did everything in your power to help me when they did. I'm not blaming you for anything. In fact, I am very thankful that you are willing to possibly face a harsh burden for all of our sake."
James released a breath through his teeth, feeling its warmth spread through the fur, taking his vision of the world away. "If it wasn't for me," he tried to say, was however cut off by the slow scratch along his back, being replaced by a sudden gentle pat.
"None of that talk now," Moar admonished him in a strict yet caring tone. "I am thrice your age and can very well make my own decisions, thank you very much. Just because I am not a soldier or a Deathworlder does not mean you just get to claim responsibility of my actions. I may be here to support you, but I am in no way here because of you. I do still have my own free will, and you better not forget that."
That last sentence came with a slightly heavier pat on his back, as well as a finger-waggling tone to it. James released a huff that blew some of the hairs in his face aside, before gradually pulling away from her leg and looking up. After taking a step back, he could see her large brown eye stare back at him, as her long face was turned to the side so she could look at him better. "You're right," he said, as he looked into those eyes that ultimately had seen so much more than he had. Maybe more than he could imagine right now. He had never been one to bow in front of age, but this once, after hearing her words, he believed he at least understood those who did for once. "You're right. Sorry for being presumptuous." He gave her a coy smile, indicating that he was in on the joke, and Moar nodded her head back at him.
"Now, I may not be your mother, but just this once I agree with her. You should not spend the anniversary of your life worrying about an old woman. You should rest, celebrate, and enjoy yourself. No matter what anyone may try to tell you, you have earned it. Let others carry your load for you. Whatever may happen, you can trust one thing. The galaxy will still be there when you come back for it," the Raphaelite gently told him, her voice in an unclear limbo between encouraging and admonishing, almost as if she was afraid that James wouldn't listen to her,
if her words did not at least have some bite to them. James smiled and looked down, quickly rubbing over his eyes to wipe away an oncoming tear, before it could make its way out and thus break the dam holding others back. "Yeah, all right," James said in a breathless laugh. If he was honest, even as he said it, his heart wasn't really in it. He still felt like there was so much to do, so much to protect, so much to understand, but the message he got had been clear. Right now, there was nothing he could do, and trying to change that, or to pretend it wasn't so, would be nothing more than narcissism. "Who do you think you are?" His mother's words echoed through his mind again. In their conversation, she had used those words to ask him why he kept insisting that he was at fault for anything, but even if she hadn't said it, he understood that they were also meant much more directly than that. "Who do you think you are? Have you gone delusional? Do you think you can save the galaxy all by yourself now? Think you can do something that all the people in this crew, in these free crews that have come to this world to aid you, as well as all of the people they are in contact with back home, can't do as well? You think you are better than those thousands of people, just because you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time?" He didn't want to admit it. He really didn't, considering who it came from, but it was a fair question. He glanced up at Moar one more time.
"You do not get to claim responsibility for my actions," she had said. "I do still have my own free will."
That was just it, wasn't it? Everyone here, no matter if friend or foe, they may have been here for the same reason as him. They may have even been influenced by him in their decision-making. But that didn't mean they did anything they were doing because of him. More had to play into it. A deeper belief, a deeper cause, an ingrained nurture or nature. All he could ever be was a catalyst or a lightning rod. But in the end, their actions and reactions were still their own. And as he stared up at the Raphaelite's head, his smile slowly turned more and more genuine. "More?" he asked, and had to wipe the back of his hand across his eye yet again to keep his composure.
"Yes, James?"
Moar asked, in a now deeply nurturing tone as she looked back down again. James gave another breathless laugh that had barely any voice in it, before firming his tone and speaking up. "Please, never," he said. "Don't ever be afraid to tell me anything you think about, all right? A lot is happening to all of us, I know, but I don't ever want you to hold anything back for my sake, all right?" Moar's eyes widened ever so slightly for a second, but then she nodded her head slowly.
"Of course, James,"
she said, deeply calm and serious at first. Though then her voice got a bit of its snark back, as she added,
"Do not think this old-timer is going to mince her words to spare your feelings, younging."
She released a low chuckle as James smiled up at her with a bit of glittering wetness in his eyes. "You better," he said with a mild sniffle, before moving to turn away. "Have fun catching up with Chris." He waved with the back of his hand as he began to walk away. Moar returned the wave with her long arm.
"And you make sure to enjoy your celebration,"
she replied, in a playfully warning tone. James chuckled. Though, as he fully left the room, his eyes got stuck on another giant form that was waiting for him outside, half leaned against the wall with all four of his legs crossed at odd angles, to give him a relaxed appearance. "I guess you're not coming either?" he asked Congloarch, looking into the one fiery eye that the Lizardor had actually directed at him, while the three others constantly scanned the room. The armored Tenastrocyte shook his head, keeping the one eye constantly locked on James even in the motion. "Seeing you drunk would remind me of my loss to you," he then explained half-heartedly, his deep voice almost more akin to a rumbling than an actual spoken word, to the point that James almost felt it more than he actually heard it. "I'm not a sore loser, but I think I will keep my thoughts for the time you have gotten your wild side out, and return to us after." James lifted an eyebrow up at the enormous reptiloid. "Who says I'm going to get drunk?" he asked, in a vaguely pretend offended tone, and crossed his arms. Congloarch seemed unimpressed, as he kept glancing down at him.
"Aren't you?"
he asked with a tilt of his head that was so subtle that it may as well have been implied. James dropped his facade and released a ton of air from his lungs that he didn't even know he was holding in there, in a long sigh. "Probably," he admitted, "if my conscience will let me."
"Isn't that exactly what getting drunk is about for your people?"
Congloarch inquired, in a tone that almost sounded honest. Almost. James shook his head, actually falling for it for a second. "Not always, usually it's just," he began to say before he finally realized what's up, snapping his mouth shut before he would get the already amusingly bellowing lizard any more satisfaction than that. Instead, he looked away for a moment and more quietly added a different explanation. "I'm just not sure I can bring myself to after everything." Congloarch's bellowing turned from amused to thoughtful, as he moved one of his massive hands up to scratch along the plate covering the back of his head for a moment.
"Usually I would applaud anyone for deciding against intoxication to escape a stressful situation. However, in your effort to keep surprising me at every turn, it seems that you have somehow managed to show me that there can be a bad reason, even for that."
The giant then began to muse aloud, his body slightly moving in a way that made the massive armored plates covering most of it gently shift in place. James scoffed. A bad reason not to get drunk? He wondered, finding the concept oddly intriguing, especially coming from someone like Congloarch. There were plenty of good reasons not to get drunk, and plenty of bad reasons to do it, having a hard time usually being one of them. He was curious about the explanation for it supposedly being the other way around this time. Congloarch released a mild growl.
"Don't get me wrong. By no means am I telling you that you should get drunk,"
he then explained, and slowly pushed his weight away from the wall, landing back on his own 4 feet with a loud stomp that made the ground tremble ever so slightly. Then, 2 of his eyes began to focus on James instead of just one.
"In fact, you probably shouldn't. But deciding not to do it right now because of the things that happened, it sounds almost cowardly."
James scoffed. "That's a new one," he mumbled, and shook his head. Now it was Congloarch's turn to exhale slowly.
"Do what you want. I fully support not burying your worries in any sort of poison,"
the lizard said, and began to walk in James's direction. Briefly, all 4 of his eyes were looking down at the primate, while the lizard's dagger-like teeth poked out from his slightly opened mouth.
"However, there's no reason to be afraid of it. In fact, I would argue that if you have to get drunk, there is likely no safer place for you to do it than deep in the bowels of a human warship, where nothing can bother you as you safely live out your inebriation."
As Congloarch kept approaching him, James huffed slightly and thought about that. "Where nothing can bother me, huh?" he mumbled to himself, briefly breaking eye contact with the Tenasticite until the giant stopped right beside him, placing his massive hand down onto James's shoulder, while the large maulers on his feet scratched and grabbed at the thin fabric covering the ground. As the giant said nothing in that position for a while, James took it upon himself to speak up again. "You're not even going to try and get a rematch out of this?" he wondered without turning his head, looking straight ahead instead, while feeling the pure weight of the massive hand press onto him. "You know, with the way you kept out of things recently, I'm starting to wonder if you even still like me anymore." Congloarch exhaled strongly, and his sharp teeth audibly cut the air apart, while his long tail moved in a single swoosh that blew some wind in James's direction, misplacing some of the hair from his face.
"There's not much point battling you in your current state," Congloarch informed him unceremoniously, moving just one of his fingers to tap against James's shoulder. Then he moved slightly, curling his long body into an ever so gentle curve so that it sort of encapsulated James between himself and the door's frame. "But I have not forgotten. I have not forgotten a single thing, especially not the time you have reached my back. And for it, I will keep your back free whenever you need it. But right now, you do not need it. There are thousands of soldiers and megatons of steel waiting to keep you safe. My plates and teeth, mighty as they may be, would be hardly an accessory."
He tapped James's shoulder with his finger yet again.
I was never one for extensive celebrations, the giant then finished, and suddenly removed his hand from James again, straightening out his body so that he would no longer block James's path. But how do your people say? Drink one for me?
James now finally glanced back over his shoulder. Going to have to be a big one, though, he mused.
It's good to be back in the saddle, Coco proclaimed with a highly satisfied tone, as she shimmied her shoulder to glide deeper into the pilot's seat of the rather roomy Unkindness-class ship that she had audaciously assigned to herself to carry her and her 2 passengers up to the larger ships to rest. Apparently, simply using a shuttle like they usually did wasn't stylish enough for the occasion, and therefore the commander had taken it upon herself to sweeten things up. It wasn't exactly the first time that James had caught a ride in the back of one of Coco's flights. However, during his military days he had always belonged to the ground or planetside troops, and that hadn't really changed now, meaning that sitting in a combat-ready hunter like this wasn't really something that he was used to by any means. Not that it was something he was super eager for either. A shuttle was certainly far better designed to take passengers along, and this was far more comfortable. The emergency seats in the Unkindness's back didn't exactly compare to the roomy interior of a ship completely made for transport. But a shuttle also didn't allow for quite as fancy flight patterns as those that Coco was surely aiming for here, as soon as they had gotten far enough away from local surveillance that no one was going to think she was crashing after making a couple of spirals. Knowing that, James had made damn sure to strap in properly, and he held the still unknown item within the white bundle that the Emerald had given him in a vice-like grip, to ensure it wouldn't go flying all throughout the ship's interior. A mild weight was leaning against his shoulder, as she pressed herself against him. One half of the gesture was simply there to make contact, enjoy closeness, and be reassuring, he knew. However, the other half was entirely designed to quite unabashedly stare down at what he was holding. While they began to ascend with enough speed that James felt his current weight increase more than 6-fold when compared to the planet's low gravity, his feline attachment finally spoke up, with her ears standing straight. "So, what is it?" she asked, and her tone showed that she was entirely unbothered by the comparatively high forces pulling on her body at that moment. It wasn't surprising. After all, her career had been a good bit longer than his, and it had been entirely spent around the prospect of flying spaceships of different kinds. A bit of fancy flying was nothing to her. "I don't know yet," James replied honestly, while allowing the bundle to be tightly pressed against his body by the force conducted from the acceleration. "I haven't looked in yet." Sheeda shifted her head a bit to direct her face to look up at his, instead of down at the item. "Why not?" she asked, and James could see that her tail attempted to work against the still increasing G-forces pushing down against it, although all that it managed was to gently lift its tip a couple of times before it immediately flopped against the seat again. James shrugged slightly. "I don't know," he said, still honest. "I guess I just didn't want to do it alone." Sheeda smirked slightly, and lifted her hand to flatly place it half on the bundle and half on his chest. "You humans are weird sometimes," she commented, and now fully leaned her head against him, closing her eyes in what seemed to be a deep relaxation. Ever since she had heard that James had agreed to actually take the time out that the Admiral had ordered him to, she had become quite calm and happy, a bit to James's surprise. He understood that she was most likely pleased by the fact that he was no longer haunting around like some restless ghost. However, he also remembered that she had wanted to have an important talk with him that they had had to postpone at least 3 times at this point. If he was honest, he would have expected her to be at least a little more annoyed and adamant about that now, that he had basically agreed to not be constantly busy for at least one night, and rightfully so. However, it didn't really seem like that was even on her mind right now. Well, either that, or she was really good at pretending it wasn't, though James really hoped that it was the first option, and she wasn't just bottling things up. Swallowing heavily, he decided to go with it, trusting that she would tell him if something was wrong. "Yeah," he said, referring to her previous comment about humans being weird. "Isn't that what I've been saying since the start?"
After a flight that had a bit more pizzazz to it than James really appreciated, he jumped out of the small ship's hatch into one of the roomy docks of the A Place in the Sun, with his legs slightly wobbly. While the commander and lieutenant commander that had flown with him both shrugged the stunts off like they were nothing. With the atmosphere in the room only recently reinstated, it took a moment before the exit door opened for them, and, likely due to some arrangements that James hadn't been privy to, they seemed to already be expected. Admittedly, James couldn't quite help but burst out in a scoffing laughter, and needed to cover his mouth with his hand for a moment, to not appear too rude as he laid eyes on just how his team was awaiting him here. He had expected leisure clothes, like they all usually wore when they weren't on duty around each other. What he didn't expect were a group of dolled up, whole 9 yards fancy, Sunday's best clad officers, looking more like they were about to go attend a high-class gala that even dress and parade uniforms were not appropriate enough for. 3 of them wore tuxedo, with colours ranging from wine red on Andrej, over sky blue on Admir, all the way to spy movie-like white on Tuya. Athena, at least so far, was the only one who had opted for a dress, wearing an elegant black, likely because her usual favourite colour was already taken, and she didn't want to match with Admir. Meanwhile, Admir was already approaching the new arrivals and loudly clapped his hands, likely disturbing some of the people around the dock that were actually working at the moment. "The man of the hour," he announced, and after a couple more claps, put his hand onto James's shoulder. "How's it feel to be one step closer to the grave?" James snorted a bit, still fighting down his earlier urge to laugh at the surprise of the fancy reception. "The same as always, I suppose," he said, as everyone else came up to greet him as well, welcoming him with long embraces and brief contact of foreheads. Andrej even moved to give him a quick, platonic kiss onto his temple. As he just pulled away from Athena, James couldn't quite help but remember how stiff it used to feel whenever they were forced to interact, back when they first started working together. Now, despite their usual bickering, there was not a moment's hesitation as they slung their arms around each other and pressed tightly. He felt her long hair brush past his hands as he broke away from the hug and turned to the next person, though, admittedly, he hesitated for a moment when he found himself face to face with Tuya. Not really because he didn't know her for as long as anyone else that was involved here, though that certainly did play a part in it. It was more because he felt slightly bad about her being here. Overcoming his hesitation, he moved in for the hug, and he needed to bend down a bit to hold the much smaller woman tightly. As his hand lay flatly on her back, he briefly shifted his head to speak right into her ear. "Are you sure it's okay for you to be here?" he wondered quietly. He definitely didn't want to make it sound like he didn't want her around, and he did his absolute best to make his tone convey as much. However, he seriously wondered if there wasn't somewhere else that she would much rather be right now. Tuya smiled as she pulled away from the hug, though she kept her hands on the sides of his shoulders. "Am I sure?" she asked, with a mild smile on her face, although James could feel it in the way that her hands grabbed onto him that a bit of doubt also remained within her. However, she then lifted one hand away from his shoulder and gently bumped it as a fist against his chest. "Nia wouldn't forgive me if I skipped out on you. Besides, somebody's got to give you our gift." James looked up in mild surprise at that, and although he didn't ask any audible question, Tuya seemed to be ready to answer his thoughts anyway. "Yep, was a real pain to keep it hidden from you this whole time, but we managed somehow," she explained, now pulling completely away from him while giving him a coy smile. "Though you're gonna have to wait until you're changed and ready." James rolled his eyes for a moment. Briefly, he wondered if he should maybe protest against having to get changed, but ultimately he decided against it. Sure, he was here to rest, but, well, a little fancy dressing never hurt anyone. Well, except maybe for people who couldn't walk in heels. Luckily, he was good in that as well, even if he probably wasn't going to need to today. Suddenly, there were 2 flat hands slapping right onto his shoulder blades, before immediately attempting to push him along. "Come on, let's go. I'll help you with your makeup," Coco cheered him on, as she attempted to move him, even if she had little chance to do so unless he allowed it, given the difference in mass. Though he didn't resist for long, as he slowly started to take deliberately slow steps just to tease her back a bit. You know, I think with all the TV masks I had to put on recently, I'll probably go natural today, he informed the commander, while Sheeta caught up with them, walking at his side with her tail gently swaying along behind her. Looking at her, he then glanced down for a moment. I hope you don't mind if I make a bit of a pit stop. Sheeta smiled gently and shook her head. We all knew you'd have to, she said encouragingly, assuring him that there was no way anyone would get annoyed at him for wanting to do the obvious. This is your day, so we can wait a bit longer. Not long after that, James found himself in a large, quite familiar room, nodding appreciatively at a doctor as he left. Once upon a time, he had woken up in this very same place, shortly after his surgery. And now, his sister was laying in what was presumably that same bed that had harbored him back then. Unlike the one she had been sleeping in previously, this medical bed wasn't comically oversized for her frame, just as the machines that were connected to her body. There were far fewer of them now, though James could still hear the machine working in rhythm as Nia's chest rose and sank, indicating she still wasn't breathing on her own. Then again, she had just undergone major surgery, and a lot of her still had to grow back together, so it wasn't unlikely that she had been placed in an artificial coma right after her natural one, so she wouldn't have to deal with the growing pains, as her flesh regenerated in ways that the human body technically wasn't supposed to be able to. As an expert and her next of kin, the doctor had allowed him to take a brief glimpse into her chart, briefly inspecting the concoction of medicine, as well as cell modifiers she had been injected with. He knew it was potent, and it had worked quite well on him whenever he needed to be patched up back in the day, so he was confident that Nia would be better soon enough. She already looked less ashy than she had when he last saw her, and her face wasn't quite so sunken in anymore. But still, for the time being, she still was so still she almost seemed lifeless as he looked down at her. Walking up to her bed, he slowly sat down on its edge, gently taking her hand into his. With his other hand, he reached out and carefully removed some of her hair from her face. Usually, she tended to straighten it at least a little bit in the morning, so right now it was a lot curlier than he had seen it in a long while. He wondered if she was going to wear it like this again at some point in the future for a second, as she just took in her face, remembering some of the many good and bad times they had together. Hey, Nia, he said quietly. He knew that sometimes people waking from comas said that they had heard people speaking during the time they were out. He didn't know how deeply he believed in it in this case. However, he felt the need to speak some things out loud. And if there was a chance that she could hear them, all the better. Guess what? It seems I forgot my birthday. Again. But you haven't. Tuya told me you tried really hard to keep a gift hidden from me for a while now. Well, your surprise was successful, and I'm sorry that you won't see me open it. But we're going to record it so you can look at it later. Honestly, I can't believe it's April already. It's almost been a year since I first left Earth now. I honestly feel like I just packed my bags yesterday, though at the same time it feels like it was more than a lifetime ago. Crazy how that works, isn't it? He swallowed heavily, to suppress the urge to get so emotional here. If she could hear him, he didn't want her to see him cry and worry again already. Not now that she was on her way to betterment. I still remember how upset you were when you found out you had flunked the first test, James chuckled in slightly forced humor. Sometimes I wonder how things would have turned out if you passed it, and we would have set out together from the start. Maybe Tuya would have felt that trying to control two people would have been too much. Maybe Reprieg would have deemed it too risky to try and follow two humans. Maybe they would have gone looking for someone else. He stopped and shook his head. It's probably better this way, he mumbled. Despite all the admonishments he had gotten about them today, he still couldn't help but give air to some feelings deep inside of him. What's happening? I wouldn't wish that on anybody else. I just really wished you didn't have to suffer for it. But if I told you I'd want to take that bullet for you, You'd probably be mad at me. But I can't help it, you know. I'm just a protective idiot. He looked away for a moment and wiped his eyes with his sleeve, pressing them shut tight to make sure nothing else was going to come leaking out. Squeezing Nia's hand tightly once more, he let his eyes glide along her smooth features as her skin gently reflected the room's light. Everyone's waiting for me, so I better get going. I know how much you hate it when I keep people waiting, he said, rubbing his thumb across the back of Nia's hand. But I'm patient. So even if I want you to get better soon, take your time. Take your time to really get better and heal properly, alright? And then, once you're back on your feet, we can repeat the birthday celebrations. Just you and me. Or, well, maybe our girlfriends as well. We'll see. Swallowing heavily, he then slowly stood up, letting go of her hand hesitantly. I better go now, before I stay too long and get all weird, he said with a mild smile. Be well. With that, he hurried out of the room before he could give in to the urge to simply keep sitting and being with her. He knew she wouldn't want that. A bit later, once he had taken the time to, at the very least, hose himself down to not carry the stench of multiple days with him anymore, he was not at all surprised to find that a certain admiral had taken the precaution of placing some of his finer clothes in his old room that had already been prepared for him on the Sun. Unlike what his colleagues were wearing, the suit was double-breasted and not a tuxedo. And as he rubbed it between his fingers, James could immediately feel that it was made from the same modified silk that the UHSDS uniforms were also woven from. However, he didn't mind that. The material was very sturdy and easy to clean, after all, so it was perfect for the evening he was about to have. Slipping into it and briefly bringing his hair into at least some semblance of a shape, James finally moved to the place where he knew everyone was meeting. For today's occasion, they had rented out this level's dojo. It was probably deemed that the padded ground of the room would offer itself well to both being sloshed and being reckless during some party activities. Being the last to arrive while carrying his white bundle with still unknown contents, he glanced around the room. Coco and Shida had also used their time to change, and now Coco was wearing an olive green dress with a much simpler but deeper cut than the elegant one Athena had opted for. And Shida wore... James raised an eyebrow. Huh. I didn't even know you owned a dress, he said, as he looked at the slightly reflective, velveteen material that his girlfriend had wrapped herself into. It was quite far removed from anything that he would usually expect Miette to wear, and so his gaze was probably a bit more sticky than it ought to be when looking at a lady, as he inspected how her current attire clung to her body. Well, Shida said and walked up to him, fully welcoming his gaze as she lifted her arms to lay them onto his shoulder. I thought I should at least try it out. How do I look? James smiled down at her, his gaze immediately moving from her body to her yellow eyes. Positively alien, he replied and leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. Shida almost immediately began to purr as they remained like that for a moment, not caring one bit that they were still surrounded by watching eyes. And to everyone's credit, not one of them said a word as they waited for those two to be done with their PDA. Eventually, the two of them pulled away from each other again, and Shida glanced up into his eyes once more. Sorry, I don't have a gift. Birthdays are handled pretty differently around Miette, and honestly, I don't think you ever even told me when yours would be, she said, in a tone that went from sheepish to impish really quickly. James just shook his head gently. Don't worry about it. I've never been good at keeping track of it myself, he assured her, and I don't need anything. I really don't. Well, too bad. A voice suddenly interrupted the little moment, as Tuya chimed into the conversation, approaching them from the side. Because we lugged this across half the galaxy to give it to you, so I'm not taking it back. Now laughing more honestly, James turned towards her and looked down, as she held out a package wrapped in simple, dark blue wrapping paper with both hands. It's from me and Nia, Tuya repeated what James already knew, but officially now. Happy birthday. James nodded thankfully, and gently took the box from her. Thank you, he said, although his words were a bit drowned out as that first happy birthday had immediately acted as a starting gun for everyone else to loudly and, as is tradition, as off-key as possible, sing happy birthday for him. Wincing slightly at the deliberately crooked tones, James began to unwrap the box, revealing a nondescript carton that was closed with a simple latch. Opening that as well, it revealed, "You have got to be kidding me!" James burst out laughing, and almost dropped the box once he had fully seen what was inside. "You fuckers had me seriously believing this would be some heartfelt gift?" Sheeda quickly snatched the box from him, wanting to see what is so funny. And inside she found what looked like bags filled with colourful little wax, or rubber moles that seemed to be hollow and very vaguely in the shape of claws. And indeed, a small label printed onto the bags confirmed that suspicion, as it read in colourful letter, "Claw Caps." Though seemingly scribbled on with a pen, there was the additional message of, "Only fools don't wrap their tools. Always wear protection." Sheeda couldn't help but snort as well as she read the message, and Tuya seemed to be quite happy that at least the joke landed, while the rest of the room erupted into laughter as well once the gift was handed around for everyone to inspect it. "I should have come up with that," Abby mumbled to himself, sounding almost honestly disappointed that he didn't. "Or you should have gotten him something at all. Some boyfriend you are." Coco used his misery as a stepping stone to tease the man, and obviously, Abney was game right away. "Ex-boyfriend," he corrected the commander with a sharp tone that was obviously put on. "It's not my job to get him anything anymore. Besides, you've known James longer than any of us. How come you didn't get him anything?" Coco's smile slowly shifted into a mischievous and salacious smirk. "Oh, Jamie knows exactly the kind of gift he can get from me any time he wants to. He only has to ask," she informed Admir, but also took the time to briefly glance over at James, as she reached up and ran her hands along the sides of her hair, making a motion as if to tie it back, even though it was already braided into a ponytail, which she now briefly tugged on while making direct eye contact, before sinking her hand down again. With a loud snort and a mild blush, Abe raised his hands in surrender, indicating that Coco had won this round. Meanwhile, Sheeda's attention had only been very briefly distracted by Coco's display, before going right back to the white bundle that James still hadn't opened. Giving in to her wordless demands, James finally moved to remove the single band keeping the cloth wrapped up, before grabbing its side to allow the content to tumble out. What emerged from it was a long sword with a silver sheath, though what caught James's attention much more than that, almost immediately, was the handle. A messer, he wondered as he picked the weapon up, pulling it out of its cover to inspect the blade. Just like the Marmaluke he had once carried around, it was clearly made of carbon tube-enhanced steel. Stepping into the room, he gave it a few tentative twirls and flourishes. He hadn't expected much else, to be honest, but it certainly felt good in his hand. The balance was excellent. This thing must have been expensive. "How is it?" Andrej immediately asked, to which James quickly turned the weapon to hold it by its blade to hand it over to the Major. Taking it from him, Andrej too handled it for a moment to get a feel for it. "Wow, this is great," he mumbled to himself. "Say what you want, the Admiral knows her stuff." James tilted his head at him. "Do you want it?" he offered openly, not really feeling any attachment to the blade. It was nice, sure, but he couldn't help but wonder why she would give him exactly a gift like this, exactly now. Andrej chuckled and shook his head. "Thank you, but despite everything we've been through, I would actually like to get to see retirement," he chuckled, before moving to give the sword back to James. However, he then paused for a second to inspect the blade yet again, as it gently glimmered in the room's lights. "Worthy of a leader," he said, to which James scoffed. "Come on, don't give me that," he complained, but was surprised when Andrej quickly shook his head. "It's engraved," the Major then informed James, and pointed to the base of the blade. And indeed, James could make out letters there. "You've got to be kidding me," he said. not at all liking the implication of his mother getting an engraving like that made for him. However, before he could get truly hung up on it, he suddenly felt something press against his side. Turning his head, he saw Tuya holding out a dark bottle for him. "Maybe this is more your speed right now," she suggested, as James took the bottle from her, and she lifted her own that she held in her other hand. A moment later, 6 dark bottles and 1 clear one with water were raised up, all held by arms that had 5 scratch marks on them, either inked or drawn in blood. "To 1 more shitty year!" Coco led the traditional cheer loudly. "To 1 more shitty year!" everyone else replied, lifting the bottles a bit higher, before bringing them bottoms up.